Welcome, folks. Jeff Giordano of the APBA Football Club here today with Arthur Franz IV, creator of one of my absolute all-time favorite sports games, Breakaway Football. And we're here to talk about, at Arthur's great suggestion, a look under the hood at some of the great NFL teams of the past and what made them great. What tools and tactics did they use to prevail time and again all the way to a ring or a pre-Super Bowl NFL or AFL championship? And our goal here is not only to look at two distinct approaches to sports-based gaming, that of the APBA style, very heavily numeric version, or Breakaway's more graphic, more narrative, more bam, pow kind of, I can play cards on you kind of a thing. And maybe this will help you add some drama to whatever games you like. Think about some ways that you might homebrew some rules or bring some personal character into the game. And speaking of personal characters, we're going to be talking about the 76 Raiders here. Mr. Biletnikoff, in fact, behind me, met Arthur and me at the Pro Football Hall of Fame. How cool was that in August?
The coolest. One of those things where it's like I'm actually at the table with Breakaway Football, folks who come up and ask questions about it. And so a friend of mine came up and said, "Hey, Fred Biletnikoff's here." And I'm like, "Well, yeah, he was inducted in the early 80s, I think." And he's like, "No, the actual Fred Biletnikoff is actually here." And I'm like, "Well, then what are we doing at this table?" And we stood up and walked out. And I said, "Wait." And I backtracked and I got for us, it's the Outlaws. That's what in Breakaway Football, the 76 Raiders. I got the team card and I'm like, "Okay, now we can go." And, maybe it was a missed opportunity to not have him sign it. I feel weird around, people who, like, he's a celebrity to me, and I grew up idolizing that. My father was a huge fan of Fred Biletnikoff, so it's almost like I didn't want to impose, but he was there and very gracious, and we got a picture with him with the car. It was awesome. So awesome.
That was tremendous. It was the craziest moment. I envisioned that moment like maybe it just kind of came true that day. There he was, and he came down to the room after we saw him out in the lobby. I was just like, what a super cool guy. And that was the first Super Bowl I ever watched in its entirety. In fact, I was just watching a little bit of it today in preparation for our talk here. The 76 Raiders, team of destiny, after years of disappointment, you look at the Super Bowl II loss in the 67 season, and then 3 straight AFL, AFC championship losses, 1 year, 1971 out of the playoffs, and then right back to the mosh pit with the Steelers and the Dolphins, and they lost the Immaculate Reception game. They beat the Steelers, but lose to the Dolphins in 73. They lose to the Steelers one step from the Super Bowl in 74. And 75, here comes 76. They're running a 3-4 defense. They've got a lights-out offense. Defense maybe a little suspect. How did you, and you research your games very meticulously, what stands out to you about how the Raiders played that season?
We always start with going back to those old packages, watching the NFL films packages and any kind of archival game footage, but also the players themselves were often, NFL greatest games and any of those packages that were put together just to get a sense of what the players were thinking, how they were approaching the game. It was really fun to see how aggressive the defense was. But yeah, you're right. Statistically, we noticed that their run defense maybe was vulnerable. And I think that's why the Patriots were able to do so much damage to them that year. All of the hoopla around their defense was really in the secondary, and I guess you have Phil Villapiano at linebacker, but it really was sort of behind the line, and the line itself probably wasn't able to control every single game. But the offense really did make up for that. One of the things that stood out to me is that Stabler was very often heard to say, "Just keep it close, just keep it close." And that was his mantra. He knew that he could bring them back late in the game. Going back to that Immaculate Reception game in 72, he's the one who ran that huge run down the sideline to score the touchdown with under a minute to play that really would have cemented the Raiders' legacy, even more. But obviously fates intervened. So, what we looked at was, where are they strong and really where are they weak? And we've known the Raiders just historically have been a high penalty team. And so part of our strategy in designing the team was it's a team of high profile characters, and we wanted to make it kind of challenging to rein in the team. We didn't want to make it this powerhouse because that really didn't reflect who they were. So there's a few things on the card we chose to do that reflected how physical they were, and how they would hurt people, because they really did dominate physically. So that is actually part of this design. And then how good they were at coming back late to win. There's a whole engine around how you sort of accrue these tokens that you can spend late in the game to accomplish those tremendous come from behind victories. But yeah, they're penalty prone, and it shows in the design.
For folks who've not played Breakaway, didn't have the chance to come out to Canton and sit down with Arthur and his amazing crew, Mike Kaplan, everyone else, just an incredible crew. Man, they were life of the party, you guys. In considering Breakaway Football, think of your favorite NFL teams, or the top NFL teams, as superheroes or powerful D&D characters that have these characteristics, these powers that they can play. They can gather them up and then whip them out on you at the most opportune time. Is that a fair assessment, would you say?
Yeah, I'd never really thought of it that way, Jeff, but we are absolutely leaning into what I consider to be the top-notch propaganda from NFL films, right? They built these folks to be mythic, legendary beings, and I grew up with that sensibility. Dan Fouts and Kellen Winslow and the Epic in Miami. I mean, I watched that live, but even watching it back in replay, it's absolutely amazing what they were able to physically accomplish, and these back and forth struggles just lend themselves so wonderfully to narrative, that our goal was to create really good narrative. Because when you think back on the greatest games of all time, sure, you might remember some of the statistics, and those are important, but it really is about the back and forth, the ebb and flow of the game, and sort of how it all worked itself out, so that we kind of leaned into that, but it always has this statistical underpinning. It's very important that the teams be proportionally strong relative to each other, because we want plausible results. We don't want to just play an arcade game of the helmet against the helmet. That's not the goal. It really is based on that single season's statistics, the attitudes of that team, and what they were capable of. So like teams that aren't very good at certain things, we want to reflect that in those mechanisms that they aren't very good at it, which is why the Outlaws, the Raiders of 76, are prone to create more penalties. They benefit from the penalties, believe it or not.
Now, that's something that APBA kind of bakes into its cards, the penalties. Mm-hmm. And I understand some of the older Stratomatic cards didn't even have penalties in it, but it's that kind of how things work over the course of a season. That's really interesting. And let's spotlight a little bit of that 76 season. Legendary season, still a 14-game schedule, 2 new expansion teams, the lowly Bucks and the semi-lowlier Seahawks.
Yes.
Unfortunately, the Buccaneers had to play the entire AFC, including the 11-3 Colts and Patriots, the 10-4 Steelers and Bengals, and of course the Raiders went 13-1. They started their season, did Oakland, with a 31-28 victory over their nemesis, which kind of sets the tone for the season in 2 ways, because ultimately they met the Steelers again to get to the Super Bowl. But if you look at the 76 Raiders schedule, they won a lot of close games, as you mentioned. Stabler, just keep it close. 7-point wins. And then there was that Patriots game you mentioned. The Patriots, the 11-3 Patriots, the only team to blemish the Raiders' regular season record. And of course, they also met again in the playoffs, and the Patriots succumbed after a questionable, still very questioned to this day, call that kept a Raider drive alive and kept the Raiders en route to that ring. APBA does a couple things interestingly in its formula. They rate the offense very highly for the Raiders, but they leave a little bit of a chink in the armor, particularly in the old version of the game. Their secondary has a slightly less effective short pass game. And if you look back to that Buccaneers game, the Bucs scored 16 points on Oakland, which should probably never have happened. But in my replay of the 76 Bucs season, in which Tampa Bay finished 3-10-1, the Bucs were able to put up 17 points on the Raiders, particularly because their secondary lacked that one little extra player point that allowed the Buccaneers and their B-grade receivers to get some leverage on the Raiders. One of the things that I did for APBA, and you remember this from my page, is that I created a card. It's just kind of a player characteristic or a team characteristic card. And it really speaks to that secondary and Atkinson and Tatum. And it's a card that if you're an APBA player, you're not going to do a full season, you just want to do a quick game. I created a card where if Atkinson and Tatum are your safeties, on any incomplete long, or depending on the later game, the APBA, if you're using the later version, medium pass, if the opponent's medium or long pass is incomplete, you can roll a 2 or a 12 to see if the Raiders decided to take the receiver out of the game, basically. So, that's our modest nod to more what, trying to incorporate something that Arthur does in full scale. So now
I like that.
Now one thing I didn't do, and then you tell me, because you're statistically basing all your outcomes and all that interplay of cool characteristics. I didn't stress test this in any way. This is kind of a free play card, but it might be useful to limit it to 2 or 3 times a game for something.
Right. Yeah, it depends. I mean, because that's always the tug of war in Breakaway. We've got the playbook construction and the strengths of the playbook. And you also have these team specific mechanisms that are just like extra things that you can do. And most of them are good. Some of them are actually negative, especially for the $76, which we did design in Team Creator. I think all of their stuff is negative, right? But poor guys. But yeah, I think that's smart that the short passes, because you don't look at the game film and see Tatum and Skip and all those guys like come up to the line. You don't see a lot of press coverage. You don't see them rocking people inside that 5-yard window. They're really doing that on those deep ins or those crossing routes or taking people's heads off, 10, 15, 20 yards downfield. So I think that's really appropriate. I think that's right. Yeah. Oh man, that team was something. They were fun to watch. I'll tell you about the run defense. The way that we kind of manage their run defense is that most Breakaway teams have very, very similar run play values because there's just only so many ways to do it. So like tight run is usually a 4 value. On the run side, wide run would be a 3, and then as you move into other formations, it becomes a 3 and a 2. The Raiders, though, start with lower values, and so the reason for that is that we have incorporated this ability for them to injure their opponent, but it's a function of coaching. So it's not just something you can deploy or something that just happens to you. You have to call the right play against your opponent. So if you get a defensive breakaway, then you pull a game day card and there's a 50-50 shot that you'll actually injure somebody and take a penalty for it. Mm-hmm. So the way it works is when you get a defensive breakaway, it can result in an injury. That's how we modeled it, is that as a function of coaching, you can, by just being smarter than your opponent on that down, potentially actually injure them. Now, what does the injury do? It actually increases the likelihood that your defense improves. It reduces your opponent's run or pass value. And so that's how their run defense becomes good enough in that half where they go club somebody and he's carted off, and now all of a sudden their runs are 1 lower. Well, effectively your run defense is 1 higher. So like now you're back to good footing, and you can actually, if you injure them enough, you can reduce their pass effectiveness, and like you can really physically dominate a team, which is unusual for other breakaway teams. We don't have mechanisms for all the teams to be able to do that. So that's why this team is so unique. But they don't just get that to start, and they don't have it in their back pocket and can use it when they're clever enough to do it. They have to earn that through clever coaching. And I think that really talks about how effective John Madden was as a coach. We look at their history and see how many, like a murderer's row of just legendary football teams these guys had to go through, meat grinders every year. There's a reason this team is legendary and yet only won 1 Super Bowl. They had to go through Shula's Dolphins at the height of their power. They had to go through Noel's Steelers at the height of their power. They found that 1 crack in the cement in 1976 and slid right in there and got their Super Bowl. Or else, if those other teams aren't as dominant, we could be looking at the Raiders being the team of the 70s with like 5 Super Bowls. I think they were that good.
Absolutely. Offensively, Stabler, 66.7% efficiency that year, completion rate, 27 touchdowns. What a well-rounded team. Van Egan and Clarence Davis in the backfield, CD is a pretty decent receiver, and then Mr. Blatnikoff, clutch as you know what, with Dave Casper as the magical tight end, and then the absolute vertical speedster Cliff Branch. I mean, what can't you do with this offense, really?
Right. Right. It really can do anything. And that's one of the challenges when you're trying to look at their actual results and go, why is a team this loaded with talent having to come from behind so regularly, winning so many close games? What's happening? I always felt like the design needed to show how they get in their own way until it really matters, and then they don't. And so that's been the point of it. And that's why the Outlaws really are one of the toughest breakaway teams to coach. For example, they have an over-the-hill kicker. So if you look at their kicking game, they had two different kickers. They were both really bad, like just epically bad, even for their own time frame. They were bad. It's fun to compare today's kickers to sort of older kickers, and you see the disparity in what field goal range really meant. A 50-yard plus field goal was an event back, 40 years ago, and now it's commonplace. But even then, these guys were just bad. Was it Errol Mann who was the
Bad Man? Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Who missed,
And they,
on the Raiders' first drive in the Super Bowl, misses a 29-yard field goal.
yeah.
Formation, no place to go. Errol Mann has hit only 4 of 11 field goals. Started the season with the Lions. The Vikings know him. Vikings have a penchant for blocking kicks, as you know. 15 this year they blocked. Holding is David Hunt. 29-yard attempt. Slight wind against him. The kick is up, and the kick is righting. No good. It hit the left upright.
And so that was a really interesting head scratcher for me because, if you just model that straight, they're a -3 to all field goal attempts, which is cripplingly bad. You're only going to kick a field goal from like the 20-yard line in, and you're not even guaranteed to make it. So I'm like, why would anyone choose to do that? So I really wanted to incentivize people to do that. And I also needed to really have like air brakes on the design, because you can design the playbook and the playbook is going to have certain strengths, but if you just sort of allow folks to use that willy-nilly, then the team is going to dominate, and that's not what that team did. It's almost like they had to kind of rev up and get going before they really were dominant. So in breakaway football, we have what are called challenge flags, which are ways that you can mitigate luck. Most teams have 2. Some teams only have 1. The Outlaws have 1, but they are unique in that it is locked at the beginning of the game. So they actually technically start with none. And again, they have to earn their 1 challenge flag. Guess how they earn it? They have to try a field goal. They don't have to make it. They just have to try it. And so that justifies why, at the edge of reason, the edge of field goal range, why would Madden kick a 48-yard field goal with Errol Mann? Like, he's never going to make that. It's to unlock his challenge flag. So it was just trying to figure out how can we incentivize the right behavior that matches history, but make it make sense within this game. It's something that you want to do, even though it's probably not going to work, but like, I still want to do it because I get a benefit out of it.
It's almost like a pawn sacrifice kind of a thing.
Yeah, exactly. Because you really need that challenge flag. And again, that kind of helps put the air brakes on that team early because they can't really mitigate bad luck. So they're very susceptible to bounces of the ball, as it were. But later in the game, when they have it, they're less susceptible to it.
So in your game, and your game primarily focuses on 1958 Colts to the present day, although you mentioned Team Creator, which allows you to create any team you want pretty much,
Yep.
just about any era. And I can attest that you really need to be a smart coach in this game, because you really need to, it's not just a dice roll where you have a probability. It's about really outwitting your not only the coach in front of you, but kind of keeping your team in check, really watching what you've got in the scheme of all the teams you've officially carded and created. Who do the Outlaws match up against best and worst?
I think they match up really well against teams that also start slow and have to kind of crest upward. So the 1980 Browns would be a really interesting matchup to see 76 Raiders against the 80 Browns, because they're both going to start in the lower middle of their strength, but then they both ramp up, and the fourth quarter is going to be electrifying. I think I'd really be interested, and I would love anybody who's out there who wants to like play this, like just send me a message and we'll play. But I'd love to see Barry Sanders against the 76 Raiders. I think that would be super fun because their run defense isn't that great. And one of the tactics in Breakaway to try to limit Barry Sanders is to not overly commit to the run defense, because if you swing and miss, like if you think he's going outside and he takes it on a finesse run up the middle, he's on a breakaway and he gets a lot of extra bonuses on breakaways. It's hard to tackle him. He can't fumble, stuff like that. So a lot of teams will just call pass-oriented defenses that have good run support, and they'll just kind of, let him get what he gets. And it's interesting because every time Barry runs, he banks a token, and that token is worth one additional line. So like all he has to do is run 10 times and he's got 50 yards in his back pocket. And that creates that giant run that Barry Sanders is known for. But the Outlaws, have the ability to injure people, so they can actually shave yards. So I think that would be a really interesting matchup to see how those teams kind of interplay. I think the Outlaws would smoke them by 10, but still think it'd be fun to watch.
Yeah, for sure. Well, yeah, it is ultimately the Lions of the 90s kind of overall.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah.
Philly's Barry. God, he's Barry.
Ted Hendricks wouldn't mind taking a shot at Barry there for sure.
What's really interesting is the Blacksmiths. That's the 78 Steelers. That's a really good matchup. The Steelers and that's an obvious one. I didn't want to go to the obvious one, but I do have to mention it. Like that would be a lot of fun. I mean, in the way we've designed it, the Blacksmiths are potentially the second or third most powerful team of the 42 that we've designed. Like they're really good. I think the Orca, which is the 72 Dolphins, and probably the Pigskins, which is the 91 Redskins, are probably the three toughest. And it's just because they don't make a lot of mistakes. They grind you down, and it's just hard to get on the wrong side of them. So yeah, but the Outlaws, it requires a lot of work. So if you are a clever coach and you kind of, really understand their mechanisms and how to maximize their potential, they're deadly, because you can be losing by 10 at half and you're like, whatever, we're good, because you can come back from that pretty calmly.
Well, yeah, we talked about talked about the cardiac Browns and the cardiac cards of Coryell in the mid-70s. And, the Raiders they were a cardiac for sure. They gave them heart attacks, caused and suffered heart attacks. Kind of crazy, but yeah.
And that's what we're trying to recreate, is the ability to have the Sea of Hands and the Ghost of the Post and all these epic games with names that those teams had. And so they've got I'm looking at the card right now. They've got 5 different things they can do that break the rules, but they can only do them in the second half, and they can only do them when they're losing. So if you're with the Outlaws and you're out coaching your opponent and you have this kind of close game where maybe you're up by 3, you may have banked all of this wonderful, currency, but you can't use it because you're not losing. So the team is built to come from behind. So if it is one of these close games and you do happen to relinquish the lead in the fourth quarter, don't sweat it. You can come back. Like they can even bend time. What's it called? Work the clock. So they can use work the clock, which is draw 2 offensive cards from the discard during a timeout. They literally get to pull an extra card back into there. They're adding time to the clock. And if you watch that Steelers game, that very first game of 1976, that last 5 minutes of that game is insufferably long. Like you watch it back and go, how is this game not over by now? And it's just like, it felt like the clock was just dragging, and that's what we're trying to go for.
Wow. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, that it is a card-based mechanism for timekeeping in Breakaway. So all these teams that we mentioned, that you mentioned, Arthur, we'll be talking about in the series, folks. So a lot of good stuff to come. Going back to 76 and the other side of the ball, as it were, I don't know. I forget how many Vikings teams you've carded, but as in the America's Game series, the Lost Rings. If you were to card and create a team for the 76 Vikings, do you take into account or model aging teams that might lose gas as the game goes on, particularly under more duress? Because the 76 Vikings, I mean, they came out fairly strong, but it really was like Jeff Seaman who was kind of making some big stops. But of course, the Purple People Eaters were getting on the wrong side of 30 there at that time.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. They were on the decline. I think it was I wouldn't say miraculous, but I think it was notable that they made the Super Bowl at all. And it always helped that people had to go through Minnesota to get to the Super Bowl. And I think that team played exceptionally well in cold weather, obviously. And when we actually have them on the list, I'm really hoping to release them soon because I've been designing the 76 Vikings. They're called the Valkyries. But they're going to have an advantage when they play in weather. Well, in cold weather. So and I'm not 100% sure what it is, but whatever they do that they kind of have to earn, because again, they're one of those teams that would have to rev up. If you look at their stats, and what we try to do is look at the box scores. Really, first and foremost, like when did these teams have quarters where they excelled and quarters where they really didn't. And so you'll notice the first quarter, sometimes first half, but mostly the first quarter for the Vikings is pretty bad. They kind of have to get warmed up before they really start doing anything, which is why in the Super Bowl, when they block that kick, I mean, first of all, Ray Guy does not have kicks blocked. And they did have, especially not in a big game. First round draft choice. Let's be real, Hall of Famer. But no, it happened. And they have the ball at the 5-yard line or inside the 5. And I'm like, how did this team not score? Because I knew they didn't score. And I'm like, how did they? And they cough it up. I'm like, you've got to be kidding me.
Ray Guy will punt. Lenny Willis of Ohio State is deep. He played here in the Rose Bowl with Ohio State. Many of these people out there in the field have been to the Rose Bowl. They know it. Here's Guy with a low snap. It's got first punt he's ever had blocked. And the Vikings have the ball. On the open 3-yard line. He never had a punt block. He has now. It looks like to me got in there. And that's the big play the Vikings are famous for. Their guy, he's thinking now. Back up in the middle. Nothing. Fumble there and a loose ball. Oakland recovered and the Vikings lost their chance. The Raiders recovered and Willie Hall.
So I think the Vikings got out-coached. I read articles when I was designing the Outlaws, and Madden on Tuesday before the Super Bowl was ultra confident that they were going to win. All the players were strutting around like they knew they were going to win. And it's because they saw something on film. And I think it was how, I shouldn't say ineffective, but how vulnerable the Vikings were to the left side of that offensive line in the running game, Shell and Upshaw. And so they were just going to, run behind this giant great wall of Oakland, and Clarence Davis had a breakout day. He wasn't even supposed to be the main guy. So everybody came to play, but yeah, I think they got out coached. But if we were going to do a Vikings team, they would definitely have an advantage in cold weather, something significant. They would have to kind of rev up to get into a game, and once they kind of revved up to full speed, then they'd be very effective. Fran Tarkenton, historically is one of these scrambling quarterbacks who can run really well. You look at his stats in 76, and like you said, he was on the wrong side of that equation. He did a lot of scrambling, but it was only to extend a play. So if we did a Fran Tarkenton kind of mechanism, it would be to scramble him around, basically give you some extra game day cards to try to complete a pass. But it wouldn't be as good as like a Patrick Mahomes mechanism. We have that for the chefs, they're called, the Chiefs, and also the Centurions. We actually have 2 Patrick Mahomes teams. It wasn't because we're fanboys of Patrick Mahomes. When we designed the Centurions, I didn't know that he was going to go on this tear of Super Bowls and whatnot. And we designed the team that won the Super Bowl last year, and I liked it so much. I'm like, well, I guess we're going to have 2 Mahomes teams. We're not going to do a third. And I was telling people, even if they went undefeated this year, I'm not doing a third Mahomes team. That's ridiculous.
Wow.
But anyway, yeah, Mahomes has a wonderful ability to extend a play and always get something beneficial out of it. I don't think Fran Tarkenton at that age would always get something benefit. It would be a high probability that you're going to get something good, but sometimes you might get stuck where he gets sacked or throws a pick because it just didn't work out, and that models what the game film shows. So those are, I think their running playbook would be really strong. It was Foreman. I had never really watched Foreman run. I mean, I'm 51. It's a little before my time. Whew, he was impressive on film. Like, I was stunned at how good that guy is because I really didn't grow up knowing him.
Vikings on their 15-yard line. Target and bootlegging. Comes back to this side. Hits
Yes, sir.
Foreman. Foreman dancing away. He has a first down. 32-yard line, Chuck Foreman. He's the most dangerous man in this field today. Probably he and Cliff Branch.
I know it. Probably not that way, but this reminds me of a play you'd make up back in the street game somewhere. Fake to Foreman first. You see him a slight delay. Targeting rolls to his right. Comes back to Foreman, who delays in the middle. Comes back. This is the move. Kurt, when you look at the really top running backs today, Foreman, of course, is one of them. Simpson, Peyton, maybe in Chicago. This is, I think, of all of them, we got a first down. I think he could also play wide receiver and be all pro.
So yeah, their run playbook would be very strong. Yeah, that's basically how I think it would work out. And on the defensive side, their run defense wasn't anything to write home about, but their pass defense was. I think you still had Paul Krause back there. So, yeah, they might have an elevated risk or an elevated capability of getting an interception. The one thing I know we would do, I guarantee this would be in there, is they would have a high probability to block a kick, either a punt or a field goal, because they had like 13 that year. I think they were like averaging one block a game or something. So we would definitely want the likelihood to be kind of a 50-50 shot for people to be able to block a kick. Up to the coach when they want to deploy it, whether it's a punt or a field goal. So like, you pick your spot. But yeah, you basically have a coin flip chance to block a kick, which is very high because normally that's only like a 2 to 4% chance that you would block a kick. So yeah.
Nice. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Mahomes because one of the kind of single card mods I created is kind of an X factor card for him where he can kind of unbreak a play, and if you're rolling incomplete, you might. And again, this should probably be narrowed down to limited usage, but although for the APBA folks who know, someone was playing the 2019 Chiefs in Canton in 2023, and Mahomes just in that basic APBA numbers heavy card had this magic built in. It's like every third and long he was converting. It's like,
awesome.
So whatever mechanism you folks are prone to use, it's interesting how these things play out on the tabletop. So, Arthur, it's been a real pleasure here. Folks, you can watch some great demos. Arthur, where should they look to see Breakaway in action and maybe grab a couple sets?
I think, you can always go out to YouTube. We have the Uplink Underground Games YouTube channel. Of the 42 franchises that we've published, there is a video on each one of them that lasts anywhere from, 5.5 to as long as 13 minutes, but they're usually like 7 to 9 minutes long. And it goes over the construction of the deck, the different mechanisms, kind of some strategies that you'd want to use. It's a really easy way to kind of look at it and say, is this something I'd be interested in? There's also full game replays out there on that site, so it's probably the right way to go. What we're trying to do is just be faithful in the memory of what that team was good at, what they weren't good at, and giving you the experience of being the coach of that team and trying to make the most of what they were and just relive that magic.
What made them great? Stay tuned for the next installment. Who shall we talk about? Let us know in the comments what teams you'd like to see discussed. Arthur, always a pleasure, sir.
Thanks for having me, Jeff.
Thank you.